Okay, thank you all so much for being here. I'm very excited to be talking about these topics with you all. So I'm Nicole. I'm a health and technology reporter, and I cover the way that tech companies and platforms intersect with our physical and emotional health. And over the past couple of years, the conversations around kind of what are these platforms doing for our mental and social health kind of continued to escalate, particularly for children, teenagers, young adults. And that has sort of coincided with a real kind of mental health crisis in young people that started prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and has just kind of continued to pick up pace. So there are kind of a couple ways we can, in my experience, that we think about what social media platforms kind of mean for mental health. We think about kind of big picture questions, like what does having these platforms around mean for our communities and for kind of populations? And then we also have like everyone's very real kind of on the ground experience of what that's like to be sitting in your bedroom on Instagram. And so in our conversation today with Megan and Margot, we're hoping to kind of bring some of those things together and talk about how our big picture questions can inform our on-the-ground experiences and kind of how those on-the-ground experiences inform the way that we ask those bigger picture questions. So very excited to have you both here. Maybe we can start off with Margot telling us a little bit about kind of your trajectory on social media and how you got involved in the platforms and what that's been like.
Sure. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So my journey on social media started 10 years ago. So in around 2012, I started a YouTube channel with two of my best friends when I was a freshman in high school. At that point, it kind of felt like this underground community that you either knew about or you didn't. In hindsight, I feel very lucky to have known about it. And I started posting videos with my friends. It was totally a hobby. And then by senior year, I distinctly remember when I was looking for colleges, I was touring all of these schools, but you really only got the tour guide's stance on what the school was, and you didn't get the behind the scenes, what it was actually like to be a student there. So at this point, I probably had around 2,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I ultimately decided to go to Syracuse University, and because I didn't have those resources as an incoming freshman into college, I decided to make videos about college move-in day and showing all of those first experiences. That initial move-in day vlog for my freshman year got over 2 million views, so I kind of found this niche of, oh my God, there's other people out there that also want to know about this. So throughout college, I continued to make YouTube videos about my experience as a student, and by the time I graduated, had around 400,000 subscribers on YouTube. I graduated in 2020, which was a really interesting year to graduate. And that's kind of when TikTok was blowing up for people my age. So it's continued to grow, and it's been really interesting to be a part of that kind of community, which is now basically everyone on the face of the earth, but also observe from the outside and as a digital communication student what it means for people like me and our mental health. So I'm excited to talk about this today.
Awesome. And Megan, tell us a little about kind of how you got interested in studying these questions from kind of an academic and medical side of things.
Sure. So my initial training is as a pediatrician, and I went and did additional training in adolescent medicine, and that involved doing 3 years of specialized training in that area where I was seeing all adolescent patients, and that was around 2008. And one of the things I started hearing from my patients was the experiences they were having with early social media, so mostly MySpace. So on the one hand, I heard these incredible stories. One that's really memorable to me is I was working in a homeless youth clinic, and we had seen an uptick in the number of patients we were seeing. And so when we started to ask patients, why are we seeing so many more patients, they would say, well, You may not know this, but we have a community on MySpace of homeless youth on the West Coast, and we share information, we tell each other about resources, and that's how a lot of us heard about your clinic. And so it seemed like this incredibly powerful tool that could bring communities together, that could show folks where to find resources. And then on the other side, I heard some stories from some patients about some incredibly negative experiences they had had. One that really sticks out to me was a young woman who had really embarrassing pictures taken by folks that she thought were her friends when she was asleep, and they had posted them on MySpace. And I remember distinctly her talking about one of the most painful parts was that at the time MySpace was such a broad community that she knew that not only would other kids at her school see those photos, but her brother at the high school would see those photos, and it's possible that teachers. And so that again showed me just the power and reach of these tools and the different folks that can be impacted by either these really positive actions or these really negative actions. And so I thought that if this was what was important to my patients, then this needed to be important to me, and that's what sent me on a path of doing research in this area.
Cool. Yeah, and so that kind of idea of really positive experiences and really negative experiences, Margot, I'd be curious kind of what your trajectory has been like thinking about your own mental health, engaging with these platforms, and the mental health of your followers and the communities that you're a part of on both sides of that equation, and how have those kind of balanced out for you?
I think for me personally, one of the most positive outcomes has been a career, which was if I told myself that when I started YouTube that this would be a potential career trajectory for me, I would tell you that you were crazy. So I've had so many amazing opportunities working with my favorite brands and the brands and the products that I couldn't afford when I was younger because my babysitting money wasn't going to pay for it. And now I'm representing these brands and I get to work on global campaigns with them, which is amazing. So on the positive side, it's been for me and for a lot of other creators, amazing opportunities, which I wouldn't have otherwise. I think on the negative side, there's FOMO, which is the fear of missing out. I can see what basically all my friends are doing at any point, especially if it's amazing, which makes you feel even worse about yourself. It's comparison because you can basically just rank popularity based on followers. I can post the exact same picture as somebody else and we'll get totally different likes, and that could make me feel amazing or that could make me feel really horrible. So it's all ranked. I'm sure something that you've been looking at is a lot of people are getting face dysmorphia because of filters and looking at yourself through a selfie camera, which doesn't actually show you exactly how you look. So, I mean, I could go on and on about the negative consequences, which unfortunately I think outweigh the positive ones. But hopefully there's a way to fix that.
Yeah, and what do I mean, you're having your own experiences on social media, and you also are kind of a part of a really large community of both other creators and also kind of followers. Curious kind of what you hear from the people who are kind of engaging with you from the outside in terms of how they're experiencing the platforms. Is that something that kind of people share with you?
Yeah. So I actually have some followers here, I think. And I'm really, I'm really excited to talk to everyone afterwards, especially about this and about their own experiences. I think at least what I've been raised to preach on my platform is I have a lot of responsibility and I have to be really careful and intentional about what I'm posting. And deciding to post things or not. So I think to answer your question, sorry, would you mind repeating the question?
It's kind of the things that you hear from the people who are kind of engaging with you as a follower about kind of mental health, like what have you learned from hearing from folks?
I think everyone is struggling with the exact same things, and I think it comes in waves, and again, there's really good days and there's bad days, and there's times that your post is performing and you're going viral, and that's really amazing. But when that's not happening, it really sucks. And I hear that from people, and I think, which I can talk about more later, but because virality, this opportunity and this potential to go viral at any second is at our fingertips, with TikTok, it makes us really addicted, and it makes us feel like because we have this opportunity, we need to take it and we need to be capturing every moment. And I think everyone struggles with that, and I think it makes us dependent on our devices. And I've had multiple discussions with my followers about this, and it's really tough.
Sure, yeah. And Megan, how does that kind of resonate with the work that you've done, and kind of what are the things that we understand from kind of the big picture population level about what these platforms mean and how people are engaging with them? And kind of where are we in our understanding of that and kind of those big picture levels?
That's a really great question. So I think that we spent a lot of time talking about screen time, and I think we spent a lot of time trying to get people to tell us their screen time and then tell us whether or not they had symptoms of depression or anxiety. And if you look across that body of literature for almost 2 decades, we really don't see any population level effects. Now, that doesn't mean that individuals aren't having individual experiences or having positive impacts or negative impacts. It just means at that population level, screen time and asking people to report their screen time is not associated with mental health at that population level. Now that we put that to rest, there's some more interesting and nuance to some of the studies that are coming out now. So one of the interesting things is if you do a study where you put an app on someone's phone and measure their screen time and then ask them to report their screen time, they will almost universally overestimate their screen time. And some of the hypotheses for why that might be, hey, you have a texting exchange with a good friend. They send you a text at the end that seems a little hard to interpret. And even though you're not engaging with your phone, you're walking around thinking about that text and thinking, was that sarcastic? Was that funny? Are they mad at me? What's going on? And in your head, you're counting that, thinking about that interaction as your screen time. Similar with a post. Maybe you see a post that really gets you thinking about something, and you're walking around and you're still thinking about it. People count that as screen time. And so what we think is happening is this rumination on these interactions, which is over-interpreting people's screen time. Now, the interesting thing is there's a study from 2021 that showed if you believe that interacting with social media is bad and you overestimate your screen time, you will report lower moods and you will be more likely to report a sense of shame or guilt over your phone. So there's something going on with how we've framed our interactions with technology to feel bad about it, to feel like it's bad, to feel like we should be tracking our time, we shouldn't be on this much, we shouldn't be doing these things. There's something about that that's actually making us feel pretty bad. And so some of where I think the research is going is helping us understand what interactions do we have with technology that are really fun and connect us to people and give us a mood boost, teach us new things that we didn't know, and feel good about that. And then that might help us figure out what are the interactions that are just mindless scrolling or just procrastinating because you really need to do something else, and be able to try to set some of those aside, but letting go of some of that overall guilt that every time you touch your phone, you're doing something naughty.
Interesting. Yeah, Margot, curious, like, how does that kind of resonate with your experience and the things that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting that you bring up screen time because that's something that I struggle with because alongside doing social media, I also work for a bottled cocktail company and I do their social and digital marketing. So because of that, a lot of my workday I'm spending on my phone, and it's very productive hours. I'm either doing my emails, or I'm curating content, or I'm recording, or I'm producing, but that's all happening on my phone. And so when I get the notification at the end of the week of what my screen time looks like, half the time I'm mortified, even though I know over 60% of that time was productive. And also when I'm on social media for my personal use, that's my other career. So I'm always battling because it's embarrassing. And when people ask me what my screen time is, I do Q&As a lot on Instagram. And a lot of the time, maybe every time I do a Q&A, people will ask me what my screen time is. And I always avoid that question, even though I know it's productive and it's things that are making me happy and forwarding my career. It's something that I struggle with. So I think it's really interesting you bring that up.
Oh, I love that you just said that. And I think it gets at, we've had this obsession with quantity, but we haven't had enough conversations about quality. And what you're describing is quality, it's creation, it's creativity. If that was done on a painting canvas, no one would be judging you for how long you spent painting that canvas. So I think the conversation really needs to shift towards what is the quality of your interactions.
How do we kind of ask those questions from the research perspective? Because that's a tricky, asking someone how much screen time you have and then sending them a depression screener. That's one thing. Trying to really get into the granular elements of what someone is doing and when and why and what that means is, I would assume, much harder. So how do we kind of get at those questions then?
Oh, you're so right. I think we need to stop doing the things that are easy. I think we need to do the things that are harder. And luckily, the research methodologies have evolved where when we do studies where sometimes we've done studies called ecological momentary assessment, where we ping people at random times during the day, and we don't ask how long we might ping you through a text message on your phone saying, are you using your phone right now? Instead of asking how long, we might ask, what are you interacting with? What are you seeing? How is that what you're seeing making you feel? So we can nudge in the direction of understanding quality. But it's interesting, I think that's where we need to go with the way that we talk to youth about phones too. And it's a lot more complex of a discussion to sit down and talk about quality. People often get angry with us as pediatricians because we changed the media policy in 2016 to say, don't talk to your patients about screen time, talk to them about how they're talking to their families about media. And the pediatricians said, no, we want to go back to just saying 2 hours a day or less, so much easier. I can do that in a clinic visit, I can move on to my next patient. I can't have these long conversations about quality and relationships. So we just have to decide that we're going to do the harder things.
I have a question based off of what you just said. I think the line is getting blurry for what is quality because, like I was saying earlier, you could be watching TikTok, which may not be considered a quality use of time, but maybe you see this as a potential career, or maybe you're following influencers or you're seeing creators that you think is benefiting you. Maybe it's not really, but how are you able to, what's the line kind of between deciding what's quality and not?
That's a really great question. I think that also is another aspect of what's difficult about this, because I don't know that we can put an absolute definition on quality. I think we can understand what is that person's interaction with technology and what are they getting out of it? Are they learning something? Are they connecting to the content? Are they feeling good about what they're seeing? Are they connecting to others? Are they connecting to a community? To me, all those aspects of connection, learning, creativity, those are all measures of quality, but that's my measure. I think some of it gets at whether people are walking away feeling like, wow, that was time well spent.
Sure. Yeah, and when we think about trying to kind of narrow in on kind of what that means and how we understand people's experiences, you talked about with the screen time, we weren't seeing much effects on a population level. What does it mean to look at something from the population level versus trying to understand like where someone might fall on kind of a bell curve? And is answering a population level question useful in something like social media, which is so highly personal and people are going to have different experiences? How do we kind of reconcile that?
It's a good question. I think that we started with this population level because there was initially this moral panic that social media was infecting us somehow with depression. So I think we needed to do those big population level studies to understand what that relationship was. But now, again, I think we're getting at much more nuanced study designs to better understand. One of the terms that is coming out a lot in the research literature is this idea of differential susceptibility, the idea that what you bring to your interactions with technology will also influence what kind of experience you have and what kind of outcomes you have. So we did a study, and there's other studies that have done these types of designs where maybe you have a large population of participants, but you're not looking at across at the variable level, you're looking within that population to see if there's smaller groups who are having similar experiences and what are the characteristics of those smaller groups. So I think with a little more elegance in our designs, we can better understand, wow, here's a group that seems like they're particularly at risk. Let's better understand what's challenging them. Or here's a group that's really showing resilience and doing great. Let's better understand that to see if we can figure out how to teach others those tools.
Sure.
It's really exciting.
Yeah, that's very cool. And so when we're thinking about getting that kind of message out more, that we are thinking about this in a more nuanced way, Margo, you were talking about your thoughts about screen time and you keep getting questions about it. So the screen time and the quantity issue is still kind of, seems like the predominant way people are thinking about this generally in their kind of day-to-day lives. How do we shift that? And do you think we're starting to see that transition in people's kind of own experiences and their own understanding of social media yet?
I think that there's two big things we're seeing in the evidence, and one is more nuanced study designs to understand individual experiences as well as quality. The other interesting thing that's coming up in the literature and the evidence is there's a few studies now that really dig into parent technology use, especially parents of younger kids and teens. And some of those same population level studies that look at how much is your parent interacting with their phone and what is the kid's mental health are actually finding screen time for parents actually seems to matter. So if your parent is interacting with their phone at a high level, then that kid is more likely to have adverse mental health outcomes. Now that is a pretty tough story to go out and tell without parents going, oh my gosh, everything's my fault. But I think that's an important message that I think we can take that message and really get at how important it is for parents to be present for adolescents coming out of COVID, struggling with mental health, being really present, really there. And I think that is an exciting place where I see some of the messaging going is the value and the importance of parents and that connection that doesn't involve technology.
Yeah, I heard something else, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that because more parents have their phones in front of their faces now, and either their toddlers or their babies are on strollers or on the floor, they're growing up not seeing their parents' emotions as much. So they're growing up with hindrances of being able to identify different emotions or speak clearly because they have this device physically in between their parents and themselves.
Yes, there's been some really creative study designs to try to get at things like that. I have seen some of that literature. Another area where I've seen some literature is in the area of kids developing self-regulatory eating patterns. So if kids are learning to eat and learning when they're full or learning when they're not, and at the dinner table, the parents on the phone, they're not getting those cues and they're not getting the interaction. And so some kids will have more disruptive behavior, maybe in an attempt to get that parent's attention, or the kids will overeat because they're just not picking up on those social cues of when it's okay to stop eating. So now there's people in the obesity world doing work at parents' use of phones and kids' obesity. So again, just really creative study designs trying to understand this really complex ecosystem of how kids are growing up today.
Yeah, and Margo, when you think about your own engagement with the platforms and the stuff that you're posting and the way that you're engaging with your followers, how much does the way that your own mental health experience on those platforms has changed or is changing influence the way that you kind of present things to your followers? And are there examples of things that you do or don't do differently because you're aware of how kind of things can have an effect on the people seeing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying, I think it's really important to be careful talking about food, because I think social media can be really triggering for people's eating disorders. And of course, you don't want to kind of trigger that at any point. So I think, especially talking about food or diet culture, I tread very lightly because I don't want that to cause any issues. I think generally just being smart about what you're putting online. So I'm still doing the same things that everyone my age is doing. I'm going to parties and I'm drinking, and maybe in college when I wasn't 21, I was drinking, but I was being cautious about what I was putting online. Because I'm aware that a lot of kids and a lot of people younger than me were watching this content and using this. I think it's interesting to think about this quote that you are a combination of the 5 people you surround yourself with most. So for me growing up, before social media was big, that was my parents, that was my brothers, my friends, my teachers. And now for a lot of kids, that's their favorite influencers, or even more so now, which is kind of scarier to me, is on TikTok, you might have the same people popping up on your For You page. And these aren't people that you're necessarily following, but they're garnering views for whatever reason. And if they're garnering a lot of views and they're coming up on your For You page a lot, it's probably not for the best reason. So I don't, again, know what the solution for that is, but being conscious of who you're spending the most time with in real life and on your phone.
Yeah, and in terms of kind of solutions there, what do we know, if at all anything, based on the research, what people with influence on platforms can do to kind of create healthier engagement, or what sorts of content tend not to create kind of problems that we see? Is that a question that we kind of have a good sense of yet?
I don't think we have there's not a lot of research out there specifically on influencers. And I think that's something that we might see soon, because people understand exactly what you said, just the incredible influence and the incredible learning opportunity, but also that learning opportunity could go a lot of different ways. And I love how you describe really thinking about being so mindful about content. I think it'll be interesting to see what when we do have more research on this, what it shows, and whether there will be any sort of written or unwritten set of best practices that if you're thinking about cultivating a youth audience, what are the best practices? Yeah.
I think what worries me is that, again, a lot of the people who are getting views are doing things that are more risky and unsafe. In the last panel, they were talking about this milk crate challenge where people were climbing on top of 15 milk crates and going to the ER because of it. Or the Tide Pod challenge where people were eating laundry detergent to get views. And I think we're only going to continue going in this direction, unfortunately, because young people see that there's careers. And especially for my generation, growing up in this era of the girl boss and the CEO and Sophia Amoruso, and using anything you have to have this kind of corporate excellence opportunity. And then we grow up into this tech hellscape with social media as a tool. So we put these two things together and we say, okay, well, to be super successful overnight, I have TikTok and I have Instagram and all of these platforms that let me do this. And the way that people are doing this is by posting this outrageous content. So you just are amassing so many, especially youth, who are doing these things and putting these things out on social media. So it seems like it's just this huge snowball effect that's kind of terrifying to watch.
Yeah, so how do we think about best practices then in a time when we're still trying to understand what is a quality interaction? What are the things that affect people versus things that don't affect people? How do we kind of have those conversations when the research, which is very slow moving, research moves slower than technology, which is very difficult in a position like yours when you're trying to kind of help people. So how do we kind of intersect on that trajectory with help for people when we maybe don't have great answers quite yet?
I think in an ideal world, we really think about when kids first start interacting with technology. And sometimes I think about the analogy of when we have kids and we teach our kids to drive. So maybe they're 13 or 14 and we ask them to start paying attention to the way we drive. Maybe, telling them, talking out loud a little bit, and like, oh, you see there's a lot of traffic, so you're noticing I'm going slower. Maybe when they're 15, they get their permit, you're always driving with them, you're talking through it, you're starting in that old abandoned parking lot and then slowly moving up to some of the less busy roads, and then when they're 16, they're finally ready to go. I think that analogy could translate really well to when kids first started using technology, which for many kids today is, doing schoolwork even in first, second, third grade. So doing some of that sitting together, learning how to use Google, learning what to do when inappropriate content comes up, having those conversations about how to strategize search engines. So many parents have social media now, so even starting to talk to your kids about what you're posting about them. There's a big thing these days in sharenting and how much parents are sharing about their kids. So I think that's another opportunity to have conversations with your kid about, what are you comfortable with me sharing? This is what it means to get a like. This is what it means if I'm sharing other people's content. I think this generation of parents will be very equipped to be able to have those conversations so that then there's this foundation of communication and foundation that this is something that's okay to talk about. I'm not going to say to you, oh, that social media, it's all terrible, you should just shut it down and put it away, which is what so many kids tell me they're hearing now, which just absolutely closes down any opportunity for conversation. So that's the ideal, is to start kids out with those conversations early. But even if some people in the audience have a 17-year-old, I don't think it's ever too late to have those conversations. And I also think that it's not, it doesn't have to just be the parents. I've seen grandparents have really great connections with their kids and having their kids show them how TikTok works, or kids showing them how they've cultivated this really cool stream of content on Instagram that they're so proud of. Grandparents are in a great place to really appreciate that and ask questions and feel okay that they don't have to know how the technology works. So I really think a lot of it is about communication and being really respectful of this is something that's important to the person you're talking to.
Yeah, as you said, this isn't the message, like this is all terrible, is like maybe not the most effective one we can be getting out there. And I guess there are positive things about social media for kind of youth development and for social connection and for career and experiences. How do we make sure we're not kind of, I guess we are kind of on that side of the pendulum where people are getting the message that this is bad, but what do you think needs to be done, or how can we intercede or intersect there to get the message out that this can be positive, actually, and it's like more complicated than a good or bad thing?
Yeah, I think that's some of what we'll be working on as a next push is how do we reset that narrative a little bit? And how do we get people thinking about this as a tool that has lots of different ways that you can use it, and the way that you use it often will determine the outcome that you get. So kind of taking the value, the good or bad off of it, because it's not all good either. It's like a hammer. You can build a house, or you can, crush your own head in and really get hurt. So there's different ways to use it, but at the end of the day, it's a tool.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And Margo, I'd be curious if there's anything that you, in your experience on these platforms, have wanted to know about the impact that they have, just because you're so embedded in them. Like, what questions have come up in your mind as you watch people engage with you, as you engage with stuff in your own personal life, that you would want to know or like have answered?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what you were just talking about open communication is really interesting, and kind of throughout different generations having that conversation and that openness around social media, which I think is great. Let me think. I have to think of a question now. Maybe we can circle back when I think of one. But
Sure.
I'm learning a lot about kind of the benefits and how we can progress forward through you. So it's really interesting.
And I guess, where do you think, where does responsibility lie? Once we do have a better sense of like what is good, what is bad engagement, what are the experiences people are having, what are the mental health impacts really, then what? Like, where do we go then? Is it pediatricians and parents trying to put good resources in front of people, or is it the platforms themselves that you think should be kind of engaging with some of this stuff more seriously?
I think that social media and tech is part of a very complex digital ecosystem. So I think if we imagine an ideal world, then all of the players in that ecosystem would be involved in trying to make it as healthy as an ecosystem as it could be. So that could include parents, that could include teachers, that could include healthcare providers, mental health providers, that also could include tech companies. There's also some great nonprofits out there. Common Sense Media is one of my favorites. They do a lot of work on helping families navigate tech discussions, but it also might be legislators and having legislators understand how this works, so that when we have them involved, they're speaking about it from some place of knowledge.
Sure. Yeah. And kind of, what does the future look like, do you think, for how young people are engaging with these platforms, and what we might see in terms of as we kind of get more information about what people can be doing that's positive and healthy versus not? How does that shift the landscape, do you think, either of you?
Well, I'm going to piggyback onto that question and also ask your thoughts on the metaverse and what that looks like for youth, because that is very scary to think about. I think especially for youth, if that's where they're learning their social skills and have their entire communities be online, I think is really interesting.
Yes, I don't know. I feel like just as you said, on the research side, we're barely finally wrapping our heads around using some slightly more interesting study designs to even understand social media. How long will it take us to figure out the metaverse? Possibly a while. We'll probably be in holograms by the time we've figured out the metaverse. I guess one thing that I do think about after taking care of a lot of patients through the pandemic. And so for my role as an adolescent medicine physician, our volume of patients, inpatient and outpatient, doubled by approximately May of 2020, and it has never gone down. So we have the same number of providers, and we're caring for double the number of patients. And if you look at other adolescent medicine programs and mental health providers and pediatricians across the country, they're reporting similar numbers. So there's a lot of adolescents that came through COVID pretty banged up around the edges. But one of the things that gives me so much pause but so much hope is when you talk to youth about how they're leveraging their technology during and in this phase of COVID, many of them talk about using it to connect to family, to FaceTime grandparents, but also to check in on each other. We have a youth advisory board we work with, and we ask them for things they want to learn from us so that we can bring in speakers, so that we can think about what they want to learn. And one of the youth brought up, we want to learn about mental health resources, and we thought they meant for us, but they wanted to learn how to help their friends, because all of them had at least one friend who was really in a bad place from their mental health standpoint, and many of them had friends that they were worried about their safety, and they wanted to be the ones to help. Just thinking about that level of care and responsibility that they feel towards each other, I think is unbelievable. And many of them were using technology to look for resources, trying to call therapists for their friends, to set their friends up with therapy appointments. So I worry about what they've been through, but I'm so impressed with their care for each other. And I've seen them use technology to support each other.
And also their confidence to use this tool to find the help that they or their friends need, which is amazing.
How has, in the time you've been studying this issue, have you found any changes in how teens, adolescents are reflecting on their own social media use? Like, are people more self-reflective and thinking about this stuff more deeply than they were maybe 10 years ago? Like, what's that trajectory looked like?
Oh, I love that question. There's definitely phases. I mean, I feel like 2008 was the predator phase. Everyone was scared of predators, and you had to make your profile private so that predators couldn't find you. And then there was a phase where everyone's worried about the government spying on them. And then it turned out the government was spying, and everyone was like, oh, well, that's what we thought. And then there was a phase of, employers are going to look at this. I mean, there's these different waves. And then there became a wave of oversharing, of like, ooh, I don't care if the government or my employers are looking at this, but I don't want my friends to think I'm lame because I posted what I had for breakfast. So there became this sort of socially constructed shift of culture. And then I think with different platforms, those have been little mini cultural experiments. I always feel really good that Yik Yak didn't last very long. I think that's a really good testament to our society that Yik Yak did not survive. So, I mean, that's what I love about this area of study is I'm never bored, but I feel like my job as a scientist is to understand what are the mechanisms, what are the functionalities of these platforms, and not get caught up in like what's the new exciting thing, but really what are the uses and gratifications that impact my patients.
Cool, awesome. Well, I think it's about time for Q&A. So I think folks in the audience will be coming around with microphones, so we can do that.
Hi. Thank you very much, Dr. Moreno and everyone in the panel. So I'm a physician. Let's see. Wow. I've sat the last 2 hours of the evolution of, or devolution of where we are. So CDC recently came up with stats about in the last 30 days, any kid, and they looked at 11 to 18-year-olds who had reported any symptoms of depression or anxiety, and in 2019 it was about 9%. In 2020 it was about 31%. In 2021 it was about 41%. I sat next to a couple at dinner who were multitasking with 2 cell phones each. To your point about does the apple fall far from the tree? Having started a mental health company that's now the largest in the United States and the world, I wonder what's next? What are we going to do? What are you all going to do here to make our kids any better? Because this is just escalating out of control. And, one of the main reasons that kids seem to be escalating in their responses in the CDC is because they feel lonely. They feel like they're not connected. And while I was sitting, next to the couple who were who were actively engaging, I was actively disengaging and deleting the last of my social networks. So I'm taking it to the room here. What are we going to do?
So I guess your question is kind of where do we go from here then? We're in a kind of crisis point, and kind of what does that mean for kind of where we're going to go?
Yeah.
So I feel like your question gets at that data about parents. So So we know how important that parent relationship is, and we know that parents are on their phones more, parents are on social media more, and with COVID, more parents are bringing more work home and having a harder time disengaging. I think that's a really important thing for us to be talking about more. I think the other thing to realize is if you look at the Gen Z demographic that you're speaking of, it is the most diverse from a racial and cultural standpoint, and it is the most diverse from every other standpoint you can think of, including gender. And we currently live in a country that is attempting to, in many elections that we just saw last week, take away fundamental rights from people in their generation. I think we need to be cognizant of what it is like and I can't say that I know what it was like to grow up in the 80s and be worried about the Russians and do drills under the desk, but I don't know what it's like to grow up in a world where people say my friends don't exist or that they're terrible or I don't think we can downplay enough what the experience of growing up in that and then being forced to sit at home for up to 2 years, listening to that on the news. I think we can't recuse the societal influence on that. And so I think we got to fix society a little bit.
Yeah, I think on the brighter side of that, something very positive about social media is that these groups of kids might not have people in their immediate neighborhoods or in their schools who are like them or who look like them or feel like them. And they have access to these groups online, which is amazing. And in a lot of cases, it saves a lot of these kids because they see themselves in other people or in influencers, which is amazing. So I think also leaning into that. And I think also, like you were saying, teaching parents about why this is really important and also just being more transparent with youth about how these algorithms work. The last conversation was really interesting. If you were here, just getting insight into maybe why it looks like you have a lot of friends online or maybe why it doesn't. And maybe it's because the things you're posting are inappropriate. But just spreading more awareness about how it works because these companies have a bottom line and they need to grow for their shareholders. So they're going to keep at it and keep trucking ahead. But I think from a social standpoint, just teaching everyone how this works and how we can use it to our benefit is kind of the silver lining.
I think we also can't discount, in studies where they're asking kids, did you have symptoms of depression and anxiety? When you have more people that are aware of what depression and anxiety are, you have more people who are able to say, yes, this sounds like me. And obviously there is a huge mental health crisis. That's not to minimize that at all. But I do think it kind of reflects in some ways a little bit positively that people know how to name that experience for themselves because that is how you then are able to seek out help. It's like when you can say, I am experiencing this, that's when you can go and kind of ask for help, so.
I think that's a great point. I think we had all these things that kind of came together at this time that illustrated that rise in depression. But I think, unfortunately, the narrative was, oh, it's cell phones. It must be cell phones.
Sure.
Right over here.
Hi there, Dr. Moreno. At the beginning of the panel, you talked about at homeless youth using MySpace to share resources. Do you still see at-risk communities using social media to share resources and help each other in that same way?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that I'll build on the great comments that you made, Margot. I think what we often see is youth from marginalized communities will find other youth like them and connect and build communities online. So especially in areas, like you said, in areas where maybe there isn't another kid in your community who is trans or is goth or likes country music. I mean, it could really be anything because identity is so important to youth, and being able to find people who are like you and feel validated in that is a really critical part of adolescence. So I still hear those stories in clinic every time I go.
So I'm here as a Margot Lee fan, and I really like what you said about knowing that you hold a lot of responsibility with your platform, and I think you do have a lot of poise, and that's one thing I've always watched your content for, and kind of like that put-togetherness and whatnot, but I think that there's a lot of layers to that type of, it's called like a parasocial relationship, I've heard it called almost, and I feel like people struggle with like an imposter syndrome when they're presenting an image of themselves, and like perhaps even entering like an echo chamber of that type of identity that might only exist online. And I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's nice to meet you, by the way. This is like one of the coolest parts about what I do is I get to meet friends all around the world. I think that's very interesting, and I think something that I've struggled with personally is this idea of perception and how do I want to be perceived online, because I can use all these tricks and tools to come across a gajillion different ways. And I think my solve for that personally is just trying not to overthink it. I personally have decided not to use filters, A, because I don't think it's healthy for my viewers, and B, I think it's kind of just cringy to look back on. Whenever I have used them, it's like, oh my God, why are there flowers in my eyeballs? But I think it also just comes down to the little details that maybe I'm not thinking about, but they do come across to my audience. So am I wearing a seatbelt in the car? Am I texting when I'm driving? Am I cursing when I'm talking to my grandparents? Whatever these values are that are just instilled in me that maybe I'm not doing consciously, I think those are really the things that come through. And I think also when I'm following other influencers, it's the things that they're not really trying to present, or at least it seems like that are the things that I'm picking up on. So I think it's really interesting that you bring that up. I wonder if there's anything that I missed, though.
No, I really enjoyed hearing you.
Hi, also a huge Margot Lee fan. I actually really appreciate how you started your YouTube channel, because I was at the same time that you started it looking at Syracuse, and your YouTube was a huge decider. I ended up not going, but that's not your fault. Anyway, I think that we can see a huge trend in corporations, and I think they're caring about social responsibility because Gen Z is caring about social responsibility, and they're not afraid to walk away from a brand that does it. And I also think that that generation is very resilient, and I think that's why, compared to like the other faces that you were talking about that are all pretty negative, this trend is leading pretty positively. People want connection. The trends that are popping up are live streams, things that like in real time, Twitch, like that are 9-hour live streams, and you're basically just coexisting with someone in a parasocial relationship. I think that that can go either really positively or really negatively, and I think it depends on the larger discourse around social media that has been so negative before. So I guess my question is, how do we make the social media discourse more nuanced? Because we're almost at the point of saying, oh, you know, boys will be boys, that's just social media. And we don't want to get to that point of indifference, of like accepting the fact that these kids grew up with surrogate parents that look like iPads that are super bulky and ugly. And we just accepted that. We were just like, because it's easier, you know, to accept that.
I think just to add another comment, and I'm curious to hear what you think, but I think what's interesting now is, given how algorithms work and if brands want to get out there, there was a question in the last session about, I'm a nonprofit, I don't want to spend money on advertising, how do I get my brand out there? And long answer short, it's basically just post a ton of stuff and post things that people will want to see. And I think that urgency is really interesting because you see these brands, you're seeing so much more of brands than you ever have. If you have a clothing company, maybe 10 years ago, they put out one advertisement a week. Now they're putting probably 3 or 4 posts out a day. So you're learning so much more about these companies, and you're making so many more decisions about what they stand for every day, which I think is interesting because it becomes more nuanced because you're learning so much more about these companies and the people behind them, and if you want to support that or not.
And I really loved that question because it gets at that nuance. And I think if there's a theme or a takeaway, it's that we need to move in this space where we're using more nuanced research methods. We need to think about more nuance in the messaging. We need to have harder conversations. We need to be more elegant with our design, more mindful. All of these things are hard, but I think we're all kind of ready to do them based on what we've learned so far.
We can take one more question and then we're going to wrap up. Remember, there are games all over the building following this panel, but one more question.
Hi, how do you account for schools defaulting to the most restrictive content when allowing students to be exposed to less restrictive environment would improve their relationship with content, especially since many students' only access to the internet is through a school-issued device?
Schools is a tough one, and my experience has been that many school districts are absolutely different all over the country and even within states. So I think that schools are also running to stand still to try to figure out how to teach this. You know, do they start a technology class, or does it go into health class? Does it go into English class? Does it go into homeroom? I've seen 30 schools who have done it 30 different ways. So I think my sense is that schools are really grappling with this. Some have done amazing jobs of bringing in the idea of how to deal with content that you might find, I've even seen schools where they teach kids how to co-create content and how to be respectful in things like co-editing a Google Doc. I mean, classes like that none of us would have needed 30 years ago, co-editing a Google Doc with respect. So some schools are really way ahead, and I think other schools are just trying to tread water and hope that they don't get sued by somebody.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you all for your great questions, and thank you both for joining me. It was great.